Our planet's climate is changing. There's no question now that what we are doing is having a dramatic impact on our planet's climate. Join me as I look at what the Northeast are doing in the fight against climate change. Once we know what our climate's actually doing, it's important that we mitigate against climate change, reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So today, I've come up to Jeffries Bay to see a man about a pond. So Mike, why are we outside in the rain, in the wind, in the cold, experimenting?
Yeah, we're in the wind and the cold at Jeffries Bay, standing next to a very beautiful pond. The way the wind is gently moving the reeds, because ponds could be a real help fighting back against climate change.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about that then.
And I suspect people have heard of ideas like, we've got to plant more trees, we've got to restore our peat bogs. Of course we have. But ponds get overlooked. They get overlooked because they're small, we've all fallen over in a pond. They're all over the planet though. They're one of the habitats found on every continent, including Antarctica. They're found on Hawaii, they're found in the middle of deserts, and they suck the carbon dioxide out of the air into the plants, bury it in the mud, and there are so many ponds that it could be ponds could be a real help.
Okay, so is this something that we've known about for absolutely ages, or is this something quite new? Or
It was one of the strange things because people have always kind of ignored ponds compared to big rivers and big lakes. But over the last 20 or so years, especially in this country, people have started to realise ponds are great wildlife hotspots. Dragonflies, water beetles, but also things like the bats that come and feed, the birds that come and feed. So if it's good for wildlife, what else could it be good for? We were thinking, right, there's lots of ponds around Jeffries Bay, fantastic part of Britain for ponds. Could we come out, could we get measures of the carbon buried in the mud of the ponds? And if we could work out what is a pond worth? What is Jeffries Bay worth? What are the ponds in the whole of Great Britain worth if we could measure how much carbon there is in the mud?
okay, so tell me a little bit about that process. How do you actually do that?
It's one of those things that turns out to be trickier than you think. You think, well, can't you just sort of stick a tube in the mud or dig it out? No. We had to have a beautiful corer made by a local blacksmith in Gosford, a metal corer, and you stick it in the mud and you push really hard to get through the roots, get through the mud, and then take the corer out. And then very carefully you push the muddy core, taking little centimetre slices. It's a bit like slicing up a sausage.
Right.
And we keep these little slices, we very quickly tuck them away so they don't lose any moisture. Take them back to the lab, we weigh them, dry them, like a lot of classic sort of science work. Put them in a machine which will give us precise measures of how much carbon there is in each slice. You can then say in each core, and then you can work out
the
in
pond.
each pond. So it's a funny process. You start quite small, but we tested lots of ponds around Jeffries Bay, on the doorstep of the Centre for Life, which is fantastic. It's not far away. It's not the Amazon rainforest. It's not the Antarctic. It's on our doorstep.
You don't need some exotic travels to go and measure it.
You don't. And we realised that maybe different ponds would have different amounts of carbon. The ponds in the farmer's field, the ponds in the sand dune, the ponds in amongst wild and nature reserves. We were wrong.
Right.
We thought they're bound to be different. But there was so much variation. Individual ponds vary a lot. We thought, right, we can lump the data together. We can come up with an overall figure which we could probably apply across the whole of Britain, maybe parts of Europe, North America, similar climates. And if you imagine, metre square block of mud, about 20 centimetres deep, fairly typical pond sediment, that's got just over 9 kilograms of organic carbon. It's 9 bags of sugar worth of organic carbon locked in the mud in these ponds.
So what does that actually mean then? So 9 kilograms of carbon, what's happened there, and how does that kind of impact what's happening in the air down to the pond?
When you think of all these reeds and all the other little plants which are growing in the pond, they die, they fall into the mud, and because it's waterlogged, the oxygen which you normally need to get the decay processes working can't get in there. So all that organic matter just sits there. A little bit gets released, but most of it, year after year, it just sits there. So it's mostly the stuff that's growing in the ponds, but that's taking the carbon dioxide out of the air. So we've got this estimate, and yet that's more than a similar sized chunk of woodland or grasslands. And you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, people say let's plant trees, but you can make a pond a lot easier than planting a forest, and you can sneak ponds into little corners here and there, and they start burying the carbon very quick.
Wow.
So it looks like ponds aren't going to solve the whole of climate change, but if you add up the area of ponds in the UK, it's tiny. Their ponds are tiny. It's a lot smaller than the area of woodland, but they punch way above their weight.
So we are literally the other side of the sand dune to the sea. How would a pond compare to the uptake of carbon from seas and oceans?
Well, there's a lot of sea and there's a lot of lakes.
Yeah.
But you see, the big deal with ponds is because they're shallow and very productive. There's a lot of lakes and quite a lot of the sea are kind of a desert. That's a bit harsh on plankton. I've got nothing against plankton, but you know, it's quite, it doesn't do a lot. Whereas look at the amount that's growing here. This is just 1 year's worth of reeds.
Wow.
You don't get that apart from maybe seagrass beds or kelp beds. Most of the sea isn't burying carbon in the way these little ponds are.
So your research has essentially found out that the ponds uptake huge amounts of carbon. How would that then lead forward in the fight against climate change?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that suddenly become clear, and because ponds can be created in cities, in the countryside, it's given us an extra bit of ammo. Now, as I say, the ponds by themselves aren't going to solve climate change, but they're going to help, and you get all the other benefits. Who doesn't like a pond with dragonflies and beautiful flowers, or a little bit of pond dipping, and all the wildlife benefits you get as well as a bonus? So ponds are a bit of a win-win. We now have to maybe try to work out what kind of ponds would be better, what kind of plants would be better, because some of them could maybe release the carbon back. But it's just kicked off a lot of interest in the potential of ponds. Government agencies are looking at this going, this is interesting, and it's given us that extra arrow to our bow to fight by.
Fabulous. So as Mike says, perhaps ponds aren't the solution in mitigating against climate change, but this research has only just kicked off. And I, for one, am very excited to see where it goes.